My name is Sarah Mitchell and I'm 34 years old. At 2:11 a.m. the night before my younger brother's engagement celebration, my mother called me. She didn't say hello. Instead, she gave me an order. Tomorrow you can come, but keep your mouth shut, not one word. I sat up in bed, confused. What exactly do you think I'm going to say? Her answer came without hesitation. Emily's father owns one of the biggest companies in the state. Don't embarrass this family the way you always do. My eyes drifted to the confidential file lying open beside my laptop. Across the cover were the words, HARRINGTON Capital Group, Confidential Investigation. I stared at it for a few seconds before replying. Understood, then I ended the call. She thought I had agreed to protect the family's reputation. What I actually understood was that some lies don't need to be exposed, they eventually expose themselves. The following evening, I arrived at the Grand Riverside Hotel just before 6. Before I could even reach the reception desk, my mother intercepted me. She looked me up and down as though she were inspecting an employee instead of her own daughter. Try not to talk too much tonight. I said nothing. And please, she continued quietly, don't tell anyone what you do for a living. I almost laughed. She had spent years telling relatives I worked a small office job because the truth made her uncomfortable. Correcting her had stopped being worth the effort a long time ago. I'll manage, I replied. She nodded, clearly relieved. Inside the ballroom, nearly 80 guests filled the room, business executives, attorneys, investors, local politicians. Every important person my brother wanted to impress. My seat, however, had been placed beside the service entrance, only a few feet from the catering staff. The place card simply read, Sarah, groom's sister. Everyone else's card included a surname. Most even listed professional titles beneath their names. Mine didn't. It wasn't an accident. It never was. My younger brother, Daniel, barely acknowledged me when I arrived, but someone else did, his future father-in-law, Richard Harrington, one of the most respected CEOs in the country. From the head table, he looked toward me several times, not casually, not politely. It was the expression of someone trying to remember where he'd seen a face before. I noticed it immediately. And so did Daniel. For just a second, his confident smile disappeared, then he looked away. I had a feeling he was hoping Richard would never remember. He had no idea that before this night was over, the truth would walk across the ballroom all by itself. Dinner began with soft music, expensive wine, and the kind of conversations people have when everyone is trying to impress everyone else. My mother never stopped smiling. To anyone watching, she looked like the proud mother of the groom. I knew better. Every few minutes, she'd glance in my direction as if making sure I was still following her instructions. Stay quiet. Daniel and his fiancée, Emily, moved from table to table greeting guests. When they finally reached mine, Emily gave me a polite hug. It means a lot that you came, she said. Before I could answer, Daniel spoke. Sarah knows how important tonight is. He looked directly into my eyes. Right, I smiled. Of course. For a moment he looked relieved. He thought my silence meant surrender. It didn't. It meant I was waiting. The first course was served. Halfway through dinner, one of Richard Harrington's business partners sat beside my mother and asked a simple question. So, Sarah, what line of work are you in? Before I could open my mouth, my mother answered, Oh, nothing too exciting. She helps a few small businesses with paperwork. I slowly put my fork down. I actually own a consulting firm. My mother's smile tightened. A very small one, she added quickly. I didn't argue. There was no point. People only hear the truth when they're ready for it. Across the room, Daniel stood and tapped his glass. The conversations faded. He smiled confidently as every guest turned toward him. Thank you all for being here tonight. Everyone applauded. He wrapped an arm around Emily before continuing. I've been incredibly fortunate this year, not only because I found the woman I want to spend my life with, but because I also helped save my future father-in-law's company from one of the biggest financial mistakes in its history. The room erupted in applause. Richard Harrington remained silent. Daniel continued proudly. Earlier this year, we were preparing to acquire a company that looked perfect on paper. He paused dramatically. But something didn't feel right. I kept asking questions. I dug deeper, and eventually, I uncovered hidden liabilities that would have cost the company well over $100 million. More applause. My fingers tightened around my water glass. Every word coming out of his mouth was taken from a confidential investigation my team had completed. Even the phrases sounded familiar. Then he said a sentence that made my heart stop. A polished financial report can still hide carefully organized deception. I knew that sentence because I had written it. My senior analyst had suggested removing it from the executive summary because it sounded too dramatic. I kept it anyway. Now my own brother was standing in front of 80 people. Claiming it as his own, under the table, my mother's hand gripped my wrist. She leaned closer. "Remember what you promised." I looked at Daniel, then at Richard Harrington. For the first time that evening, Richard wasn't looking at his future son-in-law. He was looking directly at me, and the expression on his face told me something had just clicked in his memory. For a few seconds, the ballroom was filled with applause. Daniel stood proudly at the center of the room, smiling as guests congratulated him for a success that wasn't his. Only one person wasn't applauding, Richard Harrington. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on me, not with confusion anymore, with recognition. I had seen that look before. It was the expression people make when they suddenly remember exactly where they've met someone. Daniel noticed it too. His smile slowly faded. He raised his glass toward Richard, to family. And to building a legacy together. Several guests echoed the toast. Richard didn't lift his glass. Instead, he quietly stood. The room gradually fell silent as he stepped away from the head table. Daniel smiled again, assuming his future father-in-law was coming to congratulate him. He even straightened his jacket, but Richard walked right past him. Conversation stopped one table at a time. My mother's hand tightened around my wrist. "Don't say anything," she whispered. I gently removed her hand. Richard stopped beside my chair. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled politely. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm surprised to see you here." My mother looked completely confused. Richard continued, "May I ask, how are you connected to this family?" The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. I slowly stood. "I'm Daniel's older sister." A few guests nodded politely. Then I added, "And 6 months ago, your company hired my firm to investigate the Northbridge acquisition." Richard stared at me for 2 seconds, then his eyes widened. "You're Sarah Mitchell, founder of Mitchell Risk Advisory." "Yes." Before anyone could react, Richard extended his hand. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person. My board still talks about the investigation your team conducted. You saved this company from making the most expensive mistake in our history." Complete silence. Someone accidentally dropped a wine glass across the room. Daniel's face turned pale. Emily looked from him, to me, then back again. My mother whispered, "No." Richard kept speaking. "The evidence your team uncovered protected more than 2,000 employees. I've wanted to thank you personally ever since that presentation." I shook his hand. Daniel suddenly forced a smile. "Dad, I mean Richard, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My team and Sarah's company worked together." Richard slowly turned toward him. "Worked together?" Daniel nodded confidently. "She was one of several outside consultants." I looked at him calmly, then I asked only one question. "If that's true, can you tell everyone which financial discrepancy you discovered first?" Daniel froze. The confident smile disappeared from his face, for the first time that evening. He had no answer. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt long enough for everyone in the ballroom to notice. Daniel forced a laugh and looked around the room. "Sarah, there were hundreds of issues in that investigation. Nobody remembers which one came first." "I do," I replied calmly. It was a duplicate maintenance invoice for a warehouse that had already been sold 18 months earlier. The invoice looked insignificant. My senior analyst flagged it at 11:42 on a Tuesday morning. I looked directly at Daniel. "You recommended we ignore it because the amount was too small to matter." His smile faded. "I later agreed we should expand the review." "No," I said. "You tried to limit our access to the financial records twice. You also canceled 2 meetings with the acquisition team after we requested additional contracts." Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. They remembered those meetings. Richard Harrington didn't take his eyes off Daniel. "Is that true?" Daniel hesitated. "It wasn't exactly like that." Before he could continue, my mother suddenly stood up. "Mr. Harrington, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." She forced an awkward smile. "Sarah has always been sensitive when other people receive recognition." There it was, the same excuse she'd used my entire life, whenever she couldn't deny the truth. She questioned my character instead. Richard looked at her. "Mrs. Mitchell, your daughter prevented my company from losing over $100 million. What exactly should she be less sensitive about?" My mother's smile disappeared. She had no answer. Emily slowly stepped toward Daniel. "You told me you discovered everything yourself. Daniel looked at her. I led the project. I quietly shook my head. You were the internal contact. My team conducted the investigation. The final report contains over 400 pages of forensic analysis. You didn't write any of it. The room had become so quiet. Even the music had stopped. Daniel glanced toward two senior executives sitting near the stage. Neither of them came to his defense. They had attended my presentation months earlier. They knew exactly who had done the work. Just then, my phone vibrated inside my handbag. I looked down at the screen, a message from my legal director. Trace completed, watermark confirmed. Source identified, call me immediately. I read it twice. My expression changed. Richard noticed. What happened? Before I could answer, Daniel spoke quickly. Dad. Maybe we should discuss this somewhere private. Richard looked at me instead. Sarah, I slowly locked my phone. I think that would be best because I had just realized. The stolen credit wasn't the biggest secret Daniel was hiding. My phone screen went dark as I slipped it back into my purse. For a moment, no one spoke. Daniel stood frozen near the center of the ballroom, forcing himself to keep smiling even though the confidence had drained from his face. Richard Harrington broke the silence. Sarah. Would you mind telling me what that message was about? Every eye in the room shifted toward me. I took a slow breath. I don't think this is the right place to discuss it. Daniel nodded far too quickly. I agree, whatever this is, we can sort it out tomorrow. His voice cracked ever so slightly. That tiny crack told me everything he already knew. Richard folded his arms. I've spent 30 years in business, Daniel. Whenever someone wants to delay a conversation until tomorrow, it's usually because they need tonight to prepare an explanation. A nervous laugh spread through a few guests before fading almost instantly. Emily looked at Daniel. Do you know what she's talking about? He avoided her eyes. Of course not. I studied his face for a second. He couldn't even look at me. That wasn't guilt, it was fear. The kind of fear people have when they know the truth has finally caught up with them. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a call. The screen displayed only one name, Michael Carter. My legal director. I excused myself and stepped into the quiet hallway outside the ballroom. The music disappeared the moment the doors closed behind me. I answered immediately. Tell me. Michael didn't waste a second. We confirmed the digital watermark. My grip tightened around the phone. And the executive summary Daniel presented wasn't copied from the final report. I frowned. What do you mean? It came from an earlier draft. I stayed silent. Michael continued. Only 7 people ever had access to that draft. My mind immediately began listing the names, myself, Michael, 2 senior analysts, 1 cybersecurity specialist. Richard Harrington's general counsel, and Daniel. He didn't just steal credit, Michael said quietly. He stole confidential documents. A cold chill ran through me. That wasn't just unethical. It was potentially criminal, Michael continued. We also traced where the file was opened. 3 days before Daniel claimed he had discovered the financial fraud, I leaned against the wall. You're certain? Completely. There are server logs, download records, metadata, and one more thing. I closed my eyes. What? The document was accessed from an external drive registered in Daniel Mitchell's name. For several seconds, I couldn't speak, not because I was shocked. Because everything finally made sense. Daniel hadn't memorized my report. He'd been reading it, word for word. I slowly looked through the glass doors back into the ballroom. Inside. Guests were whispering. Emily stood alone. Richard was speaking quietly with 2 members of his board, and Daniel kept checking the entrance, waiting for me to come back. Waiting to find out exactly how much I knew. He had no idea. I already knew enough to destroy every lie he'd built his future on, and for the first time all evening. I wasn't wondering whether I should expose him. I was wondering who had helped him steal the report in the first place, because 7 people had access, and Daniel had never been smart enough to do this alone. The ballroom doors opened quietly as I walked back inside. The conversations that had started again immediately faded. No one pretended not to stare anymore. Richard Harrington looked at me first. What did your legal director say? I placed my phone on the table but didn't unlock it. It confirmed something I hoped wasn't true. Daniel's jaw tightened. Emily reached for his hand. He didn't notice. Richard's voice remained calm. What exactly was confirmed? I looked at Daniel before answering. The investigation report my company prepared wasn't just quoted, it was accessed. A murmur swept through the room. Daniel laughed, but it sounded forced. Sarah, are we seriously doing this now? I think we are, I replied. You've accused me of stealing a report in front of 80 people. I haven't accused you of anything, Not yet. The room fell silent again. Richard motioned toward one of the hotel's private conference rooms. I think everyone directly involved should continue this conversation somewhere quieter. Daniel nodded immediately. Yes. That's a good idea. Richard turned to him. Not everyone. He looked toward the head table. I'd like my general counsel, our chief financial officer, and 2 board members to join us. Then he looked at me, and I'd like Ms. Mitchell there as well. Daniel's expression changed. He had expected a family discussion. Instead, he was walking into what looked very much like a board meeting. 10 minutes later, the conference room door closed. The celebration continued outside, but inside the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Richard sat at the head of the table. His general counsel, Linda Brooks, opened a notebook. The CFO quietly connected a laptop to the room's monitor. Emily sat beside Daniel, looking more confused than angry. I remained near the opposite end of the table. Richard folded his hands. I'd like everyone to be completely honest. He looked directly at Daniel. Did you tell my daughter that you personally uncovered the fraud during the Northbridge acquisition? Daniel hesitated. I simplified my role. Linda looked up. Simplified? I meant that I was heavily involved. Richard didn't react. He simply turned toward me. Sarah, tell us exactly what your firm's role was. I spoke slowly. So there's no misunderstanding. My company was hired to perform an independent forensic risk investigation. We reviewed more than 80,000 financial records. We interviewed 43 employees. We reconstructed 6 years of accounting history. The project lasted almost 4 months. The CFO nodded quietly. That's accurate, I continued. Daniel wasn't part of my team. He wasn't hired by my company. He wasn't involved in writing the report. He wasn't present during the final presentation. Emily looked at Daniel. Is that true? Daniel swallowed. I attended several meetings. I nodded as the company's internal liaison. Nothing more. Richard remained silent. He was letting Daniel speak or lie. Linda opened a folder. Our records show something interesting. She pushed a printed document across the table. 3 days before Ms. Mitchell's report was officially delivered, someone requested early access. Daniel stared at the paper. His breathing became noticeably heavier. Richard asked quietly, did you request that access? No, the answer came too quickly. Linda slid another page across the table. It came from your company email. Daniel blinked. Someone must have used my account. The cybersecurity director, who had joined by video call, finally spoke. We checked. The request required 2-factor authentication. You personally approved it from your phone. Daniel's face lost what little color it still had. Emily slowly removed her engagement ring and placed it on the table. The tiny sound of metal touching wood echoed through the silent room. No one spoke, not even Daniel. Emily looked at him with tears gathering in her eyes. I asked you so many times if everything you told me was true. You looked me in the eyes, and you said yes. Daniel finally found his voice. Emily. Please, it's not what it looks like. She shook her head. No, it looks exactly like what it is. Richard leaned back in his chair. His expression wasn't angry anymore, it was disappointed. And somehow, that looked far worse. Just then, the conference room door opened unexpectedly. One of Richard's executive assistants stepped inside. Sir, you need to see this. She handed him a tablet. Richard read the screen. His expression hardened immediately. He looked up at me. Sarah, it appears your legal director has sent over something else. What is it? I asked. Richard slowly turned the tablet around so everyone could see, on the screen. Was security footage from 6 months earlier. The timestamp matched the week my report had been completed, and standing outside the restricted document archive was Daniel. But he wasn't alone. A second person walked into frame. The moment I saw the face, I felt my stomach drop because the person helping Daniel was someone I had trusted for nearly 8 years. The room went completely still. No one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the security footage playing across the tablet screen. The timestamp in the corner confirmed the date, 6 months earlier, just 3 days before my team had delivered the final investigation report. Daniel entered the restricted document archive first. A few seconds later, another person followed him. The moment I recognized the face, my stomach tightened. It was Mark Reynolds, my firm's operations director. For 8 years, Mark had worked beside me. He had interviewed candidates with me, attended board meetings with me, celebrated company milestones with me. He was one of the very few people I trusted with confidential client information. Richard looked at me. You know him? I nodded slowly. He works for me. Daniel immediately seized the opportunity. You see, he said almost too eagerly, I told you I wasn't acting alone. Emily stared at him in disbelief. That's your defense. You lied to everyone for months, and now you're trying to blame someone else. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Richard pressed a button on the tablet. The footage continued. Mark unlocked the archive using his security badge. He entered alone about 4 minutes later. He walked back out carrying a sealed document envelope. Instead of taking it toward the executive meeting rooms, he handed it directly to Daniel. No words, no hesitation, just a quiet exchange. As if they'd done it before, the room fell silent again. Linda Brooks looked at Daniel. Would you like to explain why a confidential report was handed directly to you before it was ever presented to the board? Daniel rubbed his forehead. It wasn't like that. Richard's voice remained calm. Then tell us what it was like. Daniel looked around the table. There was no friendly face left, not Emily, not Richard, not the board members. Not even my mother, who had quietly slipped into the conference room a few minutes earlier. She stood near the door, pale and speechless. Daniel finally lowered his head. It started as a mistake. No one interrupted him. The acquisition team kept asking me for updates. I wanted to impress them. I wanted everyone to think I was more important than I really was. He swallowed hard. So I asked Mark if he could let me see the report early. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, not because of Daniel. Because of Mark, someone I'd trusted had betrayed every principle our company was built on. Daniel continued. When I read it, I realized no one outside your firm knew who had actually written it. He looked at me for the first time. I thought if I presented the findings first, people would assume I'd discovered them, Emily whispered. So every compliment, every interview, every story you told me was a lie. Daniel couldn't answer. Richard slowly stood. His disappointment was unmistakable. You didn't just steal credit, you stole trust, and in business, that's the one thing money can never buy back. Before anyone could speak again, my phone rang once more. It was Michael. I answered on speaker. Michael, his voice came through immediately. We've completed the internal audit. I closed my eyes. And there are 18 unauthorized file accesses. The room stiffened. Michael continued, it wasn't just the Northbridge report. We found evidence that Mark copied confidential documents from 4 different client investigations. Richard's expression darkened. Michael wasn't finished, and Sarah, this goes much deeper than we first thought. We believe Mark wasn't working only with Daniel. I frowned. What do you mean? We traced several encrypted payments. They came from an offshore account. The room became eerily quiet. Michael's next words sent a chill through everyone present. We don't think Daniel was the mastermind. We think someone has been buying confidential corporate investigations for years, and Daniel was only one piece of a much larger operation. Richard slowly placed both hands on the conference table. This engagement party, he said quietly, just became the beginning of a criminal investigation. Outside the conference room, music was still playing, guests were laughing. Waiters continued serving dessert. They had no idea that behind one closed door, an entire corporate conspiracy had just begun to unravel for several long seconds. No one in the conference room spoke. The only sound was the faint music drifting in from the ballroom outside. It felt surreal. Just minutes earlier, everyone had been celebrating an engagement. Now, the conversation had shifted to corporate espionage. Richard Harrington finally broke the silence. Michael, how confident are you in this information? 100%, Michael replied through the speaker. We've preserved the server logs, payment records, and access history. Nothing has been altered. Richard nodded once. Don't notify anyone else yet. I want every piece of evidence secured before word gets out. Already done, Michael answered. The system has been locked down. The call ended. Richard slowly looked around the room. No one leaves until I understand exactly what's happened. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Everyone knew he meant every word. Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair. I swear I didn't know anything about offshore accounts. I looked at him carefully. For the first time that night, he actually sounded truthful. Not innocent, but frightened. Richard noticed it too. Then tell us what you did know. Daniel buried his face in his hands. When Mark gave me the report, I thought that was all it was. He said nobody would ever find out. He told me Sarah would get paid anyway, and that company's only remembered the person who presented the solution. Emily stared at him with tears in her eyes. So you believed him, Daniel nodded weakly. I convinced myself it wasn't stealing. I kept telling myself I was just taking an opportunity. I spoke quietly. No, Daniel, you stole years of my reputation. You didn't take an opportunity. You took someone else's work and built your future on it. He couldn't meet my eyes. Across the table, Richard's general counsel closed her notebook. This is no longer a family matter. This involves theft of confidential corporate information and possibly multiple criminal offenses, Richard agreed. As of this moment, Daniel, you're suspended from every project connected to Harrington Capital. His words landed like a hammer. And until this investigation is complete, your access to every company system is revoked. Daniel didn't argue, he simply lowered his head. Emily slowly stood. She looked at the engagement ring resting on the conference table, then she pushed it gently toward Daniel. I loved the man I thought you were, her voice trembled. I don't even recognize the man sitting here tonight. Without waiting for a response, she walked out of the room. Daniel watched the door close. For the first time, he truly looked broken. But the night wasn't over. Richard turned toward me. Sarah, I owe you an apology, I frowned. For what? My company trusted the wrong people. We celebrated the wrong person, and I allowed your work to go unrecognized. I shook my head. You didn't know? No, he admitted. But I should have. He extended his hand once more, this time, not as a client, but as someone asking for your help. I looked at him silently. I want Mitchell Risk Advisory to lead the internal investigation. Around the table, every board member nodded. No one objected. 6 months earlier, I had quietly protected Richard Harrington's company. Now, he was asking me to save it again. I accepted, but deep inside, one question still refused to leave my mind. Mark Reynolds had risked his career, Daniel had destroyed his future. Neither of them had the power, or the money, to organize something this large. Somewhere, someone was still hiding. Someone who had never stepped inside this room. Someone who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning, and I intended to find them. 3 days later, I stood in the conference room at Mitchell Risk Advisory, staring at a wall covered with timelines, transaction records, photographs, and strings connecting names that, at first glance, seemed unrelated. But they weren't. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had been collecting confidential corporate investigations long before Daniel ever became involved. Michael walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. You've been here since 5 this morning. I accepted the cup without taking my eyes off the evidence. I keep hoping I've missed something, and I haven't, he sighed. Our forensic team recovered the deleted files from Mark's company laptop. I turned toward him. Anything useful? He placed a thick folder on the table. More than useful. Inside were dozens of encrypted emails. Most of them contained only short instructions. Use personal device. No company network, cache only, destroy printed copies. None of the messages included a name. Every one of them ended the same way. R. I frowned. Any idea who R is? Michael shook his head. Not yet, but whoever they are, they've been giving orders for almost 2 years. I flipped to the final page. There was a payment schedule. Every transfer made to Mark matched a date when one of our clients had requested a confidential investigation. It wasn't random, it was a business. Someone had turned stolen corporate intelligence into a profitable operation. Just then my assistant knocked on the door. Sarah, Mr. Harrington is here. Richard stepped inside looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. I wish I were bringing better news. He placed another file beside mine. Our internal audit uncovered 3 more suspicious acquisitions. I opened the folder. Each company had one thing in common. They had all collapsed shortly after confidential negotiations were leaked. Richard looked at me. Someone isn't just stealing reports. They're using them to manipulate billion-dollar deals. A chill ran down my spine. This was far bigger than one engagement party, far bigger than Daniel. Far bigger than Mark. Someone had been making fortunes by knowing corporate secrets before anyone else. Before I could respond, Michael's computer chimed. He stared at the screen. His face lost all color. What is it? I asked. He slowly turned the monitor toward us. We just tracked the offshore account. Richard leaned closer. Who owns it? Michael swallowed. It isn't registered to an individual. It belongs to a private holding company. The name appeared on the screen, Blackstone Meridian Holdings. None of us recognized it. But beneath the company name was the signature of its authorized legal representative. I froze because I knew that signature. I had seen it years ago, on the paperwork from my father's estate. The room fell silent. Richard looked at me. "You know this company?" I stared at the signature, unable to look away. Then I whispered the words I never thought I'd say again. "I think this somehow leads back to my father." The room fell silent. No one spoke after I mentioned my father. Richard looked at me carefully. "I thought you said your father passed away years ago." "He did," I answered quietly, "but before he died, he worked as a corporate attorney." I stared at the signature on the screen. "I've seen this name before." Michael immediately opened the archived estate records my family had stored years ago. Within minutes, the documents appeared. My father had once represented Blackstone Meridian Holdings, but only once. He had resigned from the account less than 3 months later. Attached to his resignation letter was a handwritten note. "Some clients don't want legal advice, they want silence. I refuse to give them mine." Richard slowly lowered the document. "He walked away," I nodded, "and judging by everything we've uncovered." "He was right to." Michael continued digging through the recovered emails from Mark's laptop. Then he suddenly smiled. "I found it." Everyone looked at him. "The missing piece." He projected a final email onto the conference room screen. Unlike the others, this one wasn't signed with the letter R. It contained a full name: Ryan Caldwell, a corporate broker who specialized in arranging confidential mergers between struggling companies and private investors. Richard's eyes widened. "I know him. He tried to pitch several acquisition deals to us over the past 2 years." Michael nodded. "And every company he recommended had access to stolen confidential reports before negotiations began." Richard immediately called his legal team. Within hours, federal investigators were contacted, search warrants were issued, servers were seized, financial accounts were frozen. Over the following weeks, the truth finally came out. Ryan Caldwell had built an entire network that paid insiders for confidential corporate information. Mark Reynolds had been one of those insiders. For years, he quietly copied sensitive reports and sold them. Daniel had never been part of the organization. He was simply the easiest person to manipulate. His desire for recognition made him useful. He stole my report believing it would make him look brilliant. Instead, it destroyed everything he had built. Mark was arrested. Ryan Caldwell was charged with multiple counts of corporate fraud, conspiracy, and theft of trade secrets. Several executives from unrelated companies were also implicated as the investigation expanded. As for Daniel, he wasn't charged as part of the larger conspiracy. But he did face civil lawsuits for misrepresentation and unauthorized use of confidential material. His job disappeared overnight. His engagement to Emily officially ended months later. He asked to meet me. We sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop. He looked older than I remembered, not because of time, but because of regret. "I'm sorry," he said. "I spent my whole life trying to be the person everyone admired. I forgot how to be the person who deserved it." For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I replied, "I can forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." He nodded. "I know." It was the first honest conversation we'd ever had. My mother took much longer to accept the truth. For weeks, she insisted the family should move on. Then one afternoon, she visited my office. There were no excuses, no lectures, no comparisons. She quietly placed an old family photo on my desk. It showed my father holding my hand outside my elementary school. "I spent years looking at the wrong child," she whispered. "I was so busy protecting one that I forgot to appreciate the other." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah." For the first time in my life, I believed she meant it. Healing didn't happen overnight, but it finally began. 6 months later, Richard Harrington invited me to speak at his company's annual leadership conference. This time, when he introduced me, he smiled. "The person you're about to hear from didn't just save our company. She reminded us that integrity is worth more than talent, because talent can build success, but integrity is what allows it to last." The audience rose to their feet. Not because they pitied me, not because of the scandal, but because the truth had finally reached the people it always belonged to. As I looked across the room, I remembered my mother's words from that late-night phone call. "Tomorrow you can come, but keep your mouth shut." I smiled to myself. Sometimes you don't have to fight to expose a lie. You simply have to give it enough time, and the truth will introduce itself.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy this story, leave your thoughts in the comments. I read as many as I clean, and if you want more dropping read stories, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload.